I know you've been here a while. Let me give you some free advice. Keep some water nearby. It comes in handy. Trust me. Anyway, thank you for entertaining my question. Let me just begin by saying that, because my question to you is about the motivation for being here on the floor for you today. What brought me here a moment, I've been reading some of the accounts of what's going on here, and people are talking about this, the senator from Kentucky's involved in a filibuster. Some are already characterizing it as another Republican filibuster of one of the president's nominees. But just to be clear, I guess my question, because I understand this from everything I've heard you say and have been saying leading up to now, your primary issue that brings you to the floor today is that you've asked a very straightforward question on an issue of constitutional importance, and yet you have not received a straightforward answer. And certainly not only you have not received an answer, but we saw testimony earlier this morning that, quite frankly, I watched the video of it 2 or 3 times, and I personally do not understand why it was so difficult to basically just say yes or no. So just I wanted to start out by asking just to be clear, your motivation for being here on the floor today is not to deny the president a vote on one of his nominees. Your motivation is that you have asked this administration a very important and relevant question and have been unable to receive a straightforward answer to that question.
Mr. President, my response to this is that, yes, in fact, I've actually voted for several of the president's nominations. And my trying to draw attention to this issue is because I believe that it's an incredibly fundamental issue, and that is of how you would kill people, Americans on American soil, whether the Constitution applies, whether the Fifth Amendment applies. So my motivation in doing this is really not partisan. It is something that has to do, and I've said frankly, and I truly mean this, if it were a Republican president today, I would still be in the same place, because the American people deserve answers on this, and there are different rules in war than there are here, and we need to acknowledge and separate ourselves and say we're not in the middle of a battle zone. We still do have Miranda rights. You still do get an attorney in the United States, and it's not the same in a battlefield, but he's bringing battlefield strategy home. We have to know, and he should, before he starts doing it, at least we need to know what are the rules. Does the Constitution apply? Mr. President, I would entertain a further question from the senator from from Florida, without yielding the floor.
Yeah, without yielding the floor, Senator, the follow-up question I have is, because I think this is actually a very useful exercise for the folks that have been snowed in today, and there's nothing better to watch but C-SPAN, or have been able to be with us here today, to actually understand the structure of our government and how it was designed, because it's my personal opinion we've gotten away from some of that. So let me just describe you for a second my position, and it leads up to the question that I'm going to ask you. I'm actually a member of the Intelligence Committee, which means that we reviewed this nomination. And I have questions that I care about that were somewhat different than the valid ones that the senator from Kentucky is raising. And as a member of that committee, I asked those questions. The nominee answered those questions. But we have a job to do. I think that's what's important for people to understand. Members of the Senate have an important constitutional role to give advice and consent on these nominations. We have an obligation not just to pass these folks through, but to actually ask serious questions to determine if they're qualified for the position they're going to hold. I mean, you want your senators to be doing that, and both parties, no matter who the president may be. And so I undertook that effort as part of the Intelligence Committee. I asked my questions. I got answers to my questions. Believed that the nominee was qualified. Believed that the president has a right to his nominees, even if they're not the people that we would nominate. Believe that ultimately these nominees deserve a vote. And that's why, for example, yesterday I voted to move this nomination on. Now, just as the president has a right to his nominations and ultimately to have a vote on those nominations, so too do members of the Senate have a right to their role, and in particular to ask relevant questions on issues of important public policy and get answers from the administration. This is not, and I think sometimes this is being lost. We have different branches of government, but they're co-equal branches of government. The presidency, the executive branch, is it an important? Absolutely it's important. It's the commander-in-chief. It's the top single office in the nation. But the legislative branch is a co-equal branch with a job just as important. And in order to do that job, we have to have access to information, the ability to ask relevant questions and get straight answers. And to be frank, sometimes I feel, when we ask questions of this administration, like they feel like it's beneath them to answer questions from us from time to time. I think that's very unfortunate. I think my question is, when you're here today, Senator, raising these issues, it's my opinion, and I'd like to hear what you have to say, this is more than just an issue of the constitutionality of this particular program. It's a defense of this institution. It's a defense of the legislative branch. It's a defense of the Senate as an institution, irrespective about how you feel about the nominee or the nomination or the program or where you fall on this constitutional issue. It's a defense of this institution and of its constitutional, not constitutional right, constitutional obligation to ask relevant questions of public policy and to get answers. To ask questions so the people back home will know the answers to these questions. If we're not going to ask these questions, who's going to ask them? The press? Maybe in a press conference, but that's not what they're paid to do. That's what we're paid to do. That's what we were elected to do. So I'd like to hear your views on that, because my belief, from what I'm picking up from everything you're saying here today, you're actually on the floor here today standing up for the obligations that this institution has to ask questions like this and to be able to get straight answers to these questions.
Well, Mr. President, I think the Senator from Florida's got it exactly right. This is about checks and balances. It's about the co-equal branches of government, and it's about how we limit usurpation of power by checking and balancing each of the different powers. And so, when Montesquieu wrote that there can be no liberty when you combine the executive and the legislative, they were separated for a reason. When the Constitution says that Congress declares we're not the president, it was separated for a reason. So when we look forward to these things, and the Senator from Kansas brought this up earlier, when the president says, oh, I have the ability to determine when you are in session or not, and I can do recess appointments when I think you're out of session, boy, that is a great usurpation of power to one branch, and we should fight it as an institution, Republican and Democrat, and not make this partisan, not make these partisan issues. And so I agree with you. I think there is a need for those checks and balances, and by the body not struggling to get as much information from they can, not really even in this case as much about the individual as about the policy, then I think it is a mistake for the body not to do it. And I agree with you completely. It's something that should be defended, and it's not something to be derided as partisan, because I don't see it as partisan at all. I see it as a defense of the separation of powers and of the checks and balances. And Mr. President, at this time I would yield without yielding the floor for another question.
And this will probably be my last question. Before I get to it, let me just say that, all the other senators that are, and I know some of my colleagues have already come to the floor, and some might be watching or some might be nearby. I would just say this, just think about this for a moment. You may or may not agree with the senator from Kentucky's position on this issue. Maybe you've seen the Attorney General's answer, or you saw his testimony this morning and you're satisfied with it. Maybe you're not that concerned about this issue at all. I don't think that's the issue. I think what we need to remember is that all of us have something we care deeply about, or multiple things we care deeply about, and the day will come. The day will come when something you care about, or some issue you're involved in, or some question that you have, that you will try to raise that question. And it may be under a different administration. I think we have to remember that the president will not be president forever. There'll be a new president in 3.5 years, and after that, and so forth. And some of the folks that are here now may still be here. Some point in the future, all of us will have questions we want answered, and we will have an administration or some other organism of government that refuses to give us answers, straight answers. And when that moment comes, you will want your colleagues to rally to your side, even if they don't agree with you, and defend your right as a representative of the people of your state to ask important questions, particularly questions of constitutional importance, and get straight answers to those questions. It's my feeling here today, and the Senator will have to comment on this, if he had just gotten a straight answer to that letter, if he had just gotten a straight answer in the testimony today, this would not be necessary. If simply they would have taken in the question, which I think is a pretty straightforward question, and answered it in a straightforward way, all of this could have been avoided. This nominee could have had a vote. But instead, they've decided to go in a different direction, and it baffles me. But here's the question that I have. I think this is important as well for the folks that are watching back home. Because they may say, well, often they may say, well, why do you have to do it this way? Why can't you just ask the question and not have to do this process of stopping things from moving forward? And I think my view is, and I want to share them with the Senator and get his impressions, are twofold. Number one, because these are the tools at our disposal. That's why the system was created the way it was designed this way. One of the things that the Senate has at its disposal to preserve and protect its prerogative to ask important questions of this kind are the rules that we've set up here. And they don't protect one senator. They protect every senator here. Everyone here, even if I don't agree with you. One of the things that gives you the ability to ask and have questions I would say this is not the Secretary of the Treasury. This is not some other unrelated cabinet position. This is the Central Intelligence Agency, which is directly related to the program that the senator from Kentucky has relevant questions about. And so I guess I'd want to hear from him a little bit more about why he chose this particular nomination and why and how it's relevant to the larger question that he's asking.